Rockstar Games spent 8 years building the most realistic Wild West in gaming history. Every river, every animal, and every horse muscle behaves exactly like the real world. But I wanted to go deeper into the secrets of this Wild West.
Give me something.
I wanted to know if the Linde gang is actually a living, breathing family, or just a bunch of beautifully programmed puppets. So I did something crazy. I picked a single day and spent 24 hours straight following the gang, tracking every single member from sunrise to sunset.
Evening.
Do they actually pitch in and work hard when you aren't looking? Do they have secret routines? Or do they just stand in one place, waiting for the script to trigger? What I discovered over those 24 hours completely shattered my expectations. And it proves that Rockstar hit a dark, beautiful reality right under our noses. Chapter 1. The Hardworking Men and Women. Mr. Simon Pearson, the illusion of hard work. Let's start with the man widely considered the most hardworking provider in the entire camp, Mr. Simon Pearson. Pearson wakes up early, around 6:30 a.m. His first task is moving the heavy stew pot from the campfire over to the preparation table. Immediately after, he sits by the fire to heat up his bones and shake off the morning chill. After lingering by the fire for a couple of hours, he heads behind the camp at 8 a.m. to pee. Without washing his hands, he walks right back to his table to smoke a cigarette. Once that's done, he takes another smoke break on the side of the camp, which seems to be his absolute favorite spot. Around 9:30 a.m., actual work finally begins. He stands near his table, sharpens his knife, cuts raw meat, and throws it into the pot. He repeats this cycle 3 or 4 times. But while he's preparing the camp's dinner, he's also sneaking drinks from his personal pocket flask and taking frequent smoke breaks at his favorite spot. By 1 p.m., he finally hangs the stew pot back over the open fire. Immediately after completing his main chore, Pearson grabs a cold beer from the provisions crate, sits at the table, and relaxes. For the next 4 hours, his routine is a continuous loop. He checks the food, takes a smoke break, and drinks another beer. This goes on until the meal is fully cooked. Finally, at 5 p.m., he inspects the stew one last time and yells for the camp to come and eat.
You people want to eat or not?
After working a grand total of 8 hours, Pearson is officially off the clock. At 5:30 p.m., he picks up his accordion and walks behind the camp to play for hours. Afterward, he takes a smoke break in the exact same spot. When darkness falls, he grabs a plate of his own stew, eats it at the table, and relaxes there until going to bed around 10 p.m. Oh, and one more thing. On certain nights, you can catch Pearson sitting right by the main fire, playing his music late into the night.
Goodbye, fare well, goodbye.
Miss Susan Grimshaw, the true backing of the camp. Next, I decided to track the camp's matriarch to see if the women work harder than the men. There are 2 women who truly carry this camp, starting with Miss Susan Grimshaw. Susan is a true early bird, waking up at 5 a.m. The very first thing she does is wash her hands thoroughly to apply her morning makeup. Next, she grabs a cup of coffee and drinks it near Pearson's wagon. The moment her coffee is finished, she sprints into action. She cleans the tables, takes a quick smoke break, washes the dishes, and then cleans the remaining tables in camp. By 9:15 a.m., she walks over to Tilly Jackson's wagon, sits down, and spends an hour sewing a piece of cloth entirely by hand. At 10:15 a.m., she moves to the round table and begins crafting medicine to help the camp survive. At 12 p.m. sharp, she takes a quick break for a second cup of coffee before heading behind the camp to work on her cloth again. At 3:30 p.m., she pauses to touch up her evening makeup, then immediately returns to her sewing behind the camp. Her workday finally ends at 5 p.m. She grabs a bottle of whiskey, sits at the round table, and drinks. After finishing her drink, she takes a smoke break, grabs a plate of food, and sits on a crate near Tilly's wagon to eat dinner. Afterward, she heads to her tent to read a book, taking one final smoke break behind the camp before turning in for the night at 10 p.m. Tilly Jackson, constant motion. The second hardest working woman in the camp is Tilly Jackson. Tilly wakes up at 6:30 a.m., immediately grabs a cup of coffee, and walks over to drink it while staring off the edge of the cliff. At 8:30 a.m., she walks to her wagon and begins meticulously cleaning a tool. By 11 a.m., she returns to the cliffside to rest. At 12 p.m., she joins Susan at the square table to craft medicine for the camp's survival stash. At 1:30 p.m., she goes back to sitting on the edge of the cliff. By 3:30 p.m., she returns to her wagon to clean the exact same tool from earlier. After working on it for an hour, she moves behind the camp and stands completely isolated for hours. At 6:30 p.m., she grabs a plate of food and eats it while sitting on a rock in front of the camp. After her meal, she relaxes for a while, grabs a bottle of whiskey to drink at the round table, and finally heads to bed. Chapter 2: The Slackers and the Guards. Uncle, the professional drinker. Next, I followed everyone's favorite slacker, Uncle. When the day began, Uncle was already passed out on the bare ground near Pearson's wagon, clutching an empty beer bottle. He wakes up incredibly late, around 9:30 a.m.
Hi there.
His first move, heading behind the camp to pee. Immediately after, he steals a fresh beer bottle directly from Pearson's wagon, sits near the campfire, and drinks. From there, he wanders over to Tilly's wagon to continue drinking. By 12 p.m., he moves back to the campfire, still nursing the exact same beer bottle. He then drifts over to the round table, bottle still in hand. At 2 p.m., he finally sets the empty bottle down on Pearson's table and grabs his banjo. He plays it by the campfire for a while, takes a smoke break behind the camp, and then sits near Dutch's tent for hours doing absolutely nothing. At 4:30 p.m., he grabs a plate of food and eats it at the square table. After sitting there for a bit, he grabs a second plate of food and walks over to Dutch's tent to eat it. To cap off his exhausting day, he grabs a bottle of whiskey, drinks it by the campfire, grabs a second bottle of whiskey, and passes out right back on the ground near Pearson's wagon. Sean MacGuire, the loudmouth on guard. Next up was Sean MacGuire, whose routine looks shockingly similar to Uncle's. Sean wakes up at 7 a.m., grabs a cup of coffee, and drinks it by the fire. Afterward, he stands by a tree and spends hours sharpening a piece of wood with his knife. Once he gets tired of standing, he sits down on some wooden crates and continues sharpening the exact same wood. At 1 p.m., he moves over to a cut tree trunk, sits down, and starts playing his instrument. Afterward, he pulls a bottle of whiskey from a crate and drinks it by the campfire while listening to Uncle play music. He follows this up with a smoke break. Finally, at 6 p.m., he contributes to the camp by pulling guard duty. He patrols the perimeter until 11 p.m., takes a smoke break near the fire, downs one last bottle of whiskey, and goes to sleep. Reverend Swanson, lost in a daze. I then followed Reverend Orville Swanson, whose routine is a mirror image of Sean and Uncle. Swanson wakes up around 8:30 a.m. and walks behind the camp just to sit there for hours. Eventually, he pees behind the camp, washes his hands, grabs a cup of coffee, and drinks it alone in his tent. After taking a massive amount of time just to finish his coffee, he walks to the campfire for a long smoke break. At 2 p.m., he heads back behind the camp to pee and wash his hands again. Afterward, he retrieves a book from his tent and sits behind the camp to read. At 4:30 p.m., he gets up, moves to the campfire for another smoke break, and then goes back to reading his book, this time safely tucked inside his tent. At 7:30 p.m., he grabs a plate of food, eats it behind the camp, follows it up with a bottle of beer in the same spot, and finally goes to sleep at 10:30 p.m. Chapter 3. The Dark Reality of the Marstons. John Marston, the isolated father. Finally, I followed the camp's most iconic family, the Marstons. But despite being a family, I quickly noticed an unsettling lack of love. John Marston doesn't even sleep with his family. He sleeps in a completely separate, closed tent. John wakes up at 7 a.m. First, he grabs a cup of coffee and drinks it near the campfire. After returning his empty cup to Pearson's wagon, he walks right back to the fire. Next, he heads behind the camp to pee, washes his hands near Pearson's wagon, and around 10:40 a.m., he walks over to inspect the medicine wagon. Afterward, he walks to the camp's front entrance and stands there for hours. At 2 p.m., he walks to the edge of the cliff to smoke a cigarette. After spending 2 full hours staring into space, he walks back to Pearson's wagon, washes his face, and sits by the campfire to sharpen a piece of wood. At 7 p.m., he grabs a plate of food and eats it by the campfire. For dessert, he grabs a beer from Pearson's wagon and drinks it back at the fire. At 10 p.m., he enters his tent and closes the flaps. The truly disturbing part of John's routine? He did not interact, look at, or speak to Abigail or Jack a single time during the entire 24-hour cycle. Not once. But if you think John is a distant father, Abigail's routine is heartbreakingly worse. Abigail Marston, a cold mother. Abigail and Jack share a tent, but that's where the parenting ends. Abigail wakes up at 6:20 a.m. and immediately drinks a cup of coffee inside her tent. Still holding her cup, she walks to the front of the camp. At 10 a.m., she wanders over to the edge of the cliff. From there, she moves to the campfire, and by 12 p.m., she goes back to her tent to sit on a storage box. At 2 p.m., she makes a second cup of coffee and drinks it in her tent. Afterward, she walks behind the camp to stand in complete isolation. At 4 p.m., she returns to her tent, sits on her box, and begins sewing a cloth. At 6 p.m., she grabs a plate of food and eats it alone in her tent while sitting on her box. After dinner, she goes right back to sewing until she falls asleep at 9 p.m. It's one thing that she ignores John, but Abigail does not speak to, look at, or play with her own son, Jack, all day. Even worse, when she grabbed her dinner, she ate it right in front of him without ever cooking for him, asking if he was hungry, or offering him a single bite of food. It is terrifying to watch how Jack is being raised. Jack Marston, the forgotten child. So, how is little Jack surviving this broken home? Jack wakes up at 7 a.m. and immediately starts playing alone in the dirt. At 8 a.m., he walks behind the camp and sits completely alone on the edge of a massive cliff. After half an hour, he wanders back into camp and tries playing right next to his mother while she drinks her coffee, but she completely ignores him. Faced with total silence, he wanders back behind the camp to play by himself. At 11 a.m., he moves to the dirt in front of his tent and plays for hours right next to where his mother is sitting. She never looks down at him. At 2 p.m., he goes back behind the camp to stand precariously on the edge of the cliff for hours. As night falls, he returns to the front of his tent to play in the dark until finally going to sleep at 9 p.m. The most shocking discovery of this entire 24-hour challenge? Jack does not eat a single bite of food, nor does he drink a single drop of water or milk all day long. His mother eats right in front of him and gives him absolutely nothing. It makes you wonder how the boy is even surviving.